Angus found the events of the day difficult to put out of his mind. Who was the murdered man? Was the girl with red hair connected to him? But until he saw Ross and Susie, he'd have to leave his questions unanswered. And even when he saw them, he knew there was little they'd be allowed to tell him. Instead, he decided to try and do some writing, get back into a routine after weeks of being on the road. But his heart wasn't in it, and he spent the following 2 days staring at a blank computer screen, pacing his flat, and trying to persuade his brain to cooperate. It ignored all his entreaties, and so Angus contemplated the pile of ironing instead, pondered about dinner, wondered at the football results, and dreamt about Susie's blue eyes and dimply smile. The only break from this mental torture had been popping out to buy some milk and the evening newspaper. This could at least satisfy some of his curiosity regarding the dead man. News of the murder had been made public, and the local paper provided some basic details about the victim. He was the owner of a small gallery in Stockbridge, married with no children. The police had released his name, Geoffrey Brodie, and were asking for witnesses to come forward with any information about the night of the murder. Having read these few facts, Angus was about to Google the name when his phone beeped. Ross hadn't been in touch since Angus had returned the dog, no doubt working day and night on the case, so Angus was surprised but happy to read his text message. "Drink, blind poet, in 20 mins." Angus tapped in, "Great, see you at the pub," while he looked for his keys and jacket. All thought of Geoffrey Brodie suddenly forgotten. He was about to leave when he had a thought. Maybe Susie would be there. There was a sudden panic as he quickly shaved, dug out a crumpled but clean t-shirt, and dragged a comb through his hair. 10 minutes later, he ran out the door. Arriving late, cheeks pink and out of breath, he found Ross alone, except for a half-finished beer. They exchanged greetings. Angus got himself a pint and sat down. "How's it going?" "Well, could be better. It's been mad at the station, as you can imagine. It's not been going well, though we think we've got a lead now. But all these people keep calling with information that turns out to be completely bogus." Angus said sympathetically. "So, what's the theory?" "I can't say much, but, well, let's put it this way. Brodie seems to have had some very shady friends." "What kind of thing? Handling stolen goods? Drugs?" Ross gave a non-committal shrug. Angus was quiet a moment. "So, do you think a deal went wrong or something and ended badly for him?" "Something like that." Angus nodded. The germ of an idea had been planted, perhaps the start of a new story. His mind wandered as he supped his pint and looked unseeingly at the familiar poster-covered walls of their favourite pub. His daydreaming was interrupted by Ross getting up to greet Susie, who had just walked in the door. Angus's heart began beating just that little bit faster. "You made it then. Angus is in a world of his own again, so I could use the company." Ross grinned. "Same as usual?" Susie just nodded as she sat down with a sigh. "Hi, Susie. A long day?" Angus stammered. Yeah. It's been non-stop." She did look tired, but Angus would never have let on he thought this. They were silent while they waited for Ross to return with her drink. "Thanks," was her reply, when Ross brought over her G&T. She took a sip and finally smiled. "That's better. So, Angus, how are you? What have you been up to?" With that, the conversation started up again. A few hours later, as they stood on Buccleuch Street, ready to go home, Angus remembered the girl. "Ross, mate, I meant to tell you, there was this girl, had amazing red hair, standing watching at Arthur's Seat the other day. And, well, I saw her again and overheard her talking. Something about it being good he was gone. Do you think she had anything to do with the murder?" Ross thought a moment, but then shook his head. "I doubt it. She could have been talking about anything. But I'll get someone to look into it, just in case." "Okay, night then. Night, Susie." "Night." "Night, Angus. Sleep tight," Susie answered with a giggle and a wave. Angus went home, feeling happy to be back in Edinburgh and to already have a vague idea for his next book. Chapter 5. In the cold light of day, the story idea still seemed to have potential, but Angus knew he would need to do some research before he could start building on it. He jotted down a few notes, but quickly turned his attention to Google and Wikipedia, surfing for anything he could find on gallery owners, contemporary painting, and the Edinburgh art scene. As a child, he'd loved reading, losing himself in new worlds which couldn't have been more different from the reality of his island life. He'd also written short stories and poems, but it was only when he started writing his first novel that he felt he'd finally found something he was good at. Nevertheless, the amount of research involved had surprised him, but had also thankfully turned out to be a pleasant, if sometimes frustrating, task. At the moment, though, he could relax and enjoy it. After an hour or two, while taking a break from the computer, Angus remembered a university friend who conveniently worked in a local gallery run by a Kathleen Reed. She could perhaps help with some general information about what was involved in running a gallery, and also might have some gossip about Geoffrey Brodie, who Angus still couldn't get out of his mind. He sent her a message on Facebook to ask if they could meet. She clearly had time to kill, as an answer arrived only half an hour later. By 12:30, Angus and Amy were sitting on a bench with takeaway rolls from the deli, a few tulips swaying in the breeze beside them. "So, what is it you'd like to know?" Amy asked as she tucked into her panini. "I've got an idea for a story, and it revolves around a gallery owner from Edinburgh." "Is this to do with Brodie?" Yes, in a way. He's the spark for the whole thing." "Why? Did you know him?" "Only by reputation. Kathleen knew him, and I've often heard her talk about him. From what I can gather, he was a terrible flirt with a penchant for young female artists. He'd offered them his support, and, as his gallery was successful, it was good to have him on your side. In return, well, who knows what he expected in return, but I wouldn't have wanted to be in his debt." "But his wife, did she know?" "Must have done. But she had a good life with him, could swan about the city and jet off to Paris for the weekend, so why would she rock the boat?" They were quiet for a moment, eating their lunch. Angus turned over this new information. He wondered if this was common knowledge. Maybe he should give Ross a call and tell him, though he probably knew about it already. Was there anyone in particular he was meant to be involved with? "I don't know. There seem to have been several over the years." "Can you use that for your story?" Amy looked at him hopefully. Yes, possibly. It's still in the very early stages, and I'm not sure what direction it might take, so everything could be useful. Thanks. Not at all, she replied, satisfied. Glad I could help. But I've got to be getting back. Catch up again soon? Angus nodded and watched Amy as she walked back towards her work. He found his phone and called Ross. He repeated the gossip Amy had passed on, but Ross didn't seem that interested. We think we've got our man. Found a connection between Brodie and a guy we've been watching for years. Deals in stolen art, but has never been convicted. He's been brought in for questioning. The call ended, but Angus stayed sitting, people-watching and enjoying the spring sunshine. A group of art students walked past, and he was reminded of the red-headed girl in the green dress. Who was she? And was she connected to Brodie? Why did he even assume she was an artist? And what about Brodie's wife? Would she really just sit back and let her husband have affairs? The police may well have found the murderer, but Angus couldn't help wanting to know more about the people connected to the dead art dealer. Perhaps a visit to Brodie's gallery would provide some of the answers. Chapter 6. As the sun burned through the morning haar, Angus set off on foot in the direction of Stockbridge, the arty area of the new town. Brodie's gallery was located in Rayburn Terrace, the main street running through Stockbridge. It would be a fairly long walk, but a pleasant one, taking him through the old town and into the Georgian terraces of the new. With any luck, the mist would lift enough to allow a view over to Fife and the hills to the north of the city. Angus found walking helped the creative process. Today, though, he simply let his mind wander. It was too glorious a day to think about work. And in no time, it seemed, he'd arrived at the gallery. Brodie's written in chic silver lettering above the door. Looking through the window, Angus could see the cliched interior of a gallery. White walls, pale wooden floors, minimal furniture. Some brightly coloured canvases were hung on the walls, and a roughly hewn sculpture sat in the corner. Stopping to compose himself, he was surprised to see the crisp-loving border collie tied up to some railings. Brodie's wife must be here. As he turned towards the door, he almost collided with two large men striding out of the door, their leather jackets and aggressive demeanour not what you'd expect in an Edinburgh gallery. Slightly flustered, he watched them walk away before entering the gallery. He stopped in front of the first picture and stared at it, but didn't really see it. He was wondering who the men were and what they wanted. Slowly he forced himself to focus. He'd tie himself in knots if he weren't careful, always imagining the worst. Calm again, he concentrated on what he was looking at. A landscape of a sunny beach, the sea gently lapping at the shore. Adopting the manner associated with people looking at paintings, he moved slowly and quietly around the room, head tilted slightly so as to better enjoy the pictures. As he walked past, he noticed that a door at the back of the gallery, probably to an office or a storeroom, was slightly ajar. However, he couldn't hear anything, so continued. Back at the front door he started again, this time reading the captions and moving more randomly here and there. It didn't take long to realize the paintings were all by the same person, a woman called Katrina McPhair. Finding a leaflet on the desk at the front, he read a short biography of her. She was from Inverness, in her late 20s, had studied in Edinburgh, and was a fan of the colourist movement, something which was evident in her paintings: bold colours, vivid landscapes, and still lifes. An enthusiasm for all things Scottish. There was no photo of her, but Angus couldn't help wondering if this was the girl with the red hair. Deep in thought, he was startled by a voice. "Hello, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." He recognized the tall woman as Mrs. Brodie. She was expensively dressed and could have been anything between 40 and 60. She looked poised and steady, but a slight redness around the eyes and nose belied this. She also didn't look too happy to have a visitor. "Hello, the paintings caught my eye, so I came in for a closer look." He stopped and waited for a reply. Mrs. Brodie turned to look at the painting nearest them, a brief appearance of pain on her face. Is everything all right? You look... I'm sorry." Angus reached out a hand towards her. He suddenly felt very guilty for intruding on this woman's grief and misfortune. He was ashamed of letting his curiosity get the better of him, but didn't know how to put it right. She had now completely turned away from him, her hands held up to cover her face, clearly trying not to cry. "Should I go?" "I should go." Angus took a step towards the door. No, please stay. I'm sorry, I just need a moment. Please, have a look around." With her head bowed, she walked back to the small office. Angus hovered, unsure of what to do, but as she had left the door open, he took a few steps towards it. He could see her sitting at a small table, and on the counter beside her, a kettle and some mugs. "Would you like me to make a cup of tea?" he asked hesitantly, and received a nod in reply.